The challenge throughout has been to tell what I view as the truth about racism without causing disabling despair. What do you mean?
It seems to me that both history, my experience, current events as we read them, all point to one conclusion about racism in this society, and that, Mr. Hefner, is that it is permanent. That it is an essential, it is not an aberration, it is not what most of us believed it was 30, 40 years ago, a pimple on an otherwise beautiful complexion of America as a place of freedom and equality for all. We all believed that at one time. That was the Gunnar Myrdal report, the huge study of racial discrimination in the 40s, and we all accepted that. As a litigator, I acted on that belief, and I think, though, that even though it means tearing down in a way much of what I've done, much of what others have done, that we have to, on the tatters of what we thought would be a wonderful edifice, in the ruins, we have to see what there is to be seen. And that leads me to that conclusion.
Race theory is not appropriate for our kids to learn and to have in our school systems. We want our honest history, our real history, our patriotic history to be taught to our kids so that we can continue to protect America.
There's no room in our classrooms for things like critical race theory. Teaching kids to hate their country and to hate each other is not worth 1 red cent of taxpayer money.
Welcome to the Armwood Opinion channel here on YouTube, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that has become controversial in the past few months, made controversial only by a group of ill-informed and poorly educated conservatives, Republicans, right-wingers, the Tucker Carlsons, the Donald Trumps of the world. And we're going to answer the question, what is critical race theory? CRT, CRITS. And this is an approach that developed out of the law, pioneered in large part initially by Harvard Law professor Derek Bell, who after leaving Harvard, after the Harvard Law School stubbornly refused to hire a tenured black female professor, he left and then worked at NYU in New York. Prior to that, he had been dean of the University of Oregon Law School, and he's written many books. He wrote the definitive textbook on civil rights law. He was a civil rights lawyer for the NAACP during the 1960s under Thurgood Marshall. He graduated from law school in 1957. Passed away a number of years ago. I had the good fortune of meeting him due to the good fortune of meeting Derek Bell due to the person who writes the music that I use on this video, Drake Colley, who was a student in Harvard Law School, and he brought me up there for a project, and I asked to meet Derek Bell, and he introduced me to him because he had been an influence on me from before I went to law school myself down here in Atlanta and at Emory. Critical race scholars look at the law as it intersects with issues of race and justice. Traditionally, law in the United States law schools is taught from the perspective of neutral, objective principles which they claim underlie the law. But the reality of the law is something quite different. Law evolves as a reaction to historical events, and that's the way the critical legal scholars looked at it, which is a group that goes back to the 30s, and the critical race scholars who really developed out of the Black Studies movement of the 70s and the law movement of people like Derek Bell, the legal scholarship movement. They looked at civil rights cases in particular and how the law reacted to them, and they found that the law tended to reflect what was going on at the time. I'll give you a good example. One of the most famous cases during the civil rights era was Brown versus the school board of Topeka, Kansas, the Brown case. And Derek Bell has a wonderful book. I have it back here on my bookshelf. Yeah, looking at the Brown versus the school board case of Topeka, Kansas, Derek Bell wrote a very interesting book. I'll hold it up here so you can see it, where he examines the decision, and there are actually two cases, Brown 1 and Brown 2. And reading and studying the case, you'll find out that a large motivator in the school integration case was that the American segregation, which was, practiced throughout the South by law, and through the North, what they call de facto in practice, it was de jure in the South by law, was hurting America around the world in its battle with communism in the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union was pointing out America's hypocrisy in talking about democracy, but practicing segregation at home, which is tyranny. And Bell writes in this book, Silent Covenants, that the Supreme Court actually talks about in one of the two opinions how important this issue was for America as a nation with the third world, as it was called back in the day, the developing world we call it now. Countries in Africa and Asia were breaking away from colonialism and imperialism, and that they would see the United States and its segregation and be more inclined to align themselves with nations that openly opposed it, like the Soviet Union. So that was a major factor. So the basic thesis that Bell came up with, looking at this and a number of other issues, was that black people only make progress in America when it benefits a significant group of white people. Let me repeat that. Black people in America only make progress when it benefits a significant group of white people. And the white power structure, who wanted good relations with the developing world, saw a benefit in ending segregation, so they were willing to oppose Southern whites who wanted to keep it. And he looks throughout history and sees the same pattern. In the Civil War, the Northern industrialists did not want the competition from a slave system in the South, which would drive up the value of labor. And so they opposed slavery in the North because the free market would drive down the cost of labor. And it didn't happen for years, but Henry Ford was one of the first people to take advantage of that by bringing up black laborers from the South to work in his factories in Detroit as union busters, as strike busters. So this, again, shows how white interests are always involved. And Derek Bell looks at a series of hypothetical situations and tries to imagine how America would respond to them in the future. He argued in his book, Faces at the Bottom of a Well, that racism was permanent and that it wasn't going to end because it served a function. It kept the white working class from opposing the white upper class. If they had somebody to look down upon, particularly the poor whites who lived predominantly in the South, they could always look down on black people and have an alliance with their wealthier white people, and they did not have conflict with them, or near as much. Bell published the first major textbook of civil rights cases, and this is it. I've had it since the early 80s, before I went to law school. And one of his most interesting books about, and really laid a foundation for critical race studies, was this one, And We Are Not Saved. In this book, he creates a hypothetical heavenly courier, her heavenly court, and he has a series of hypothetical situations he creates. And he looks at certain issues and imagines how white people would react to them. And he looks at, like, the time this was written in the early 80s, the drug crisis, and that was a time that, harsh penalties and the what Michelle Alexander called the new Jim Crow was being established in the criminal justice system. Now we're seeing it in the voting system, but in the criminal justice system, these really harsh, draconian principles of law. The horrible Rockefeller drug laws are some of the most famous of those. And he argued that, hypothetically, if the same thing happened to white kids, they got involved in drugs and engaged in the same kind of behaviors that were happening in black communities, that white people would be much more sympathetic. And he calls this the hypothetical or the narrative of the dark cloud, which supposedly came over the city and only affected white kids. And this was just so dead on target, because we've seen this happen after his passing with the opiate crisis and the different reaction that white America has had to it, as opposed to with the crack crisis of the 80s, during the time that Bell was writing this book. This is something that he always talked about. And he felt that we were in a very difficult situation as black people, because racism being permanent, the biggest thing we had to deal with, and the biggest criticism that he received, was you're taking away people's hope. And Bell argued something different. He argued that slaves survived under the most horrendous conditions. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. They survived by hoping for a better afterlife. They survived by struggling to keep their families together and to prosper. I know this from stories from my family that go back to slavery. Slavery wasn't that long ago, folks. My father, who died in 1999, knew 2 generations of slaves. 2 generations of slaves. And knew plenty of stories of things that happened during slavery, which he passed on to me. So the critical legal scholars, following Bell's model, look at American society and how it reacts to race as a tool for preserving its power structure. That's the key. Now, since the 80s, you've had people like Ms. Crenshaw, who have talked about intersectionality, the combination of issues of gender and race. Then you have, of course, with Hispanics, you have a similar situation. You also have with Asians. Remember the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s, when Chinese were not allowed to immigrate. And they came up with all these genetic theories saying that Chinese had bumps on their head and it made them more criminal. They always try to couch it in science. And this has gone on in my lifetime, when they tried to claim that black people were not as intelligent as white people. I don't think they thought that at my law school. But anyway, this is something that has been typical of white America throughout its history. And they look at this, they look at the whole struggle dating back to Bacon's Rebellion, which I always talk about, in 1675 and 1676, where black rights were sacrificed, where black people were made permanently slaves, and poor whites were given the right to buy property. But the key thing to remember about Derek Bell, and the key thing to me remember about critical race theory, is it's talking about structures. The lies that the Republicans are telling it's telling dividing people by race, hate white people. No! Just the opposite of that. It's looking at structures more than individuals. It sees white people as being victims of this racist political structure. Poor whites, in large part, are poor because the rich whites have divided them from poor blacks, poor brown people, whether they be Hispanic, from Mexico, or indigenous people during the early days of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, actually the middle of the 19th century, from immigrants from Europe. Catholics in particular were discriminated against. These things were all about divide and conquer. Divide and conquer. This theory, this approach to looking at American law, has had critiques from when it was first introduced. I wrote a paper back in law school here at Emory for Frank Alexander for a jurisprudence class, advanced jurisprudence, when And he had said in class that Derek Bell did not have a legal philosophy when I mentioned him. And I thought he was crazy, because it was obvious to me that he really hadn't seriously read him. And so, with my rebellious self, my paper for his class was entitled Coming to Grips with Derek Bell, the Civil Rights Lawyer as Sisyphus. And I was using a metaphor that, a white person who knew white philosophy would understand. The myth of Sisyphus was a Greek myth that was made into a book by Albert Camus, the French philosopher. And the whole basis of it was that Sisyphus had been a bad king, and he was condemned to hell by the Greek gods. And his hell was to roll a rock up a hill, and the rock would roll back down, and he had to roll it back up. And what Bell was saying, that has been the history of civil rights in this country. If you go back to Bacon's Rebellion, where you had black people who could work as indentured servants beforehand, and then slavery became permanent, we lost rights. Then after the Civil War, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, formal slavery ended, though there were other kinds of slavery, peonage, which continued. We had the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We had the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. And we voted up until Tilden Hayes election of 1876. And the two groups of white folks from the North and the South were battling, and the South threatened to leave again. So, as usual, white folks sacrificed the interests of black folks, and they pulled the troops from the South, and then Jim Crow was established. We lost the right to vote. Segregation was put in play. Black rights were sacrificed for the benefit of whites. I call this a Sisyphean cycle. You roll the rock uphill, which is progress, and then it comes down. And we can see that right now. All of these voter suppression laws are just like the ones that were enacted in the 1870s and 1880s. We've been through this before. This is not different. This is exactly the way it happened. You see them playing with the election results in Arizona, and now they're doing it here in Georgia. A judge ruled yesterday in Fulton County that they can look at the ballots again that have been certified elections have been certified since January 6th, when the insurrection took place in Washington. But a judge went ahead and said, oh yes, you can do this. This has happened with our courts before. Remember Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, separate but equal. We had the 13th Amendment ending slavery. We had the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment. You had the voting rights, the 15th Amendment. Voting rights were taken away. There was never really equal protection under the laws. My family was terrorized in southern Georgia and then went into Florida to get away and settled in Hillsborough County. I mean, lynchings. I remember my family was lynched in 1933. In fact, the last person on record lynched in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, George Armwood, in 1933, 20 years before I was born. Exactly 22 years before I was born. This stuff happens. Now the police do the lynching. It's no different. All these lynchings, it's the same thing. It's a cycle. So what the critical legal scholars are saying, and the critical race scholars, because it's gone from law to sociology to history to psychology to all these fields, is that race has been a determinative factor in American history. And the question for us as black people and other peoples of color are how we handle it. And that's been a very difficult question. I mentioned Albert Camus with the Myth of Sisyphus. Camus once wrote that the only philosophical question is the question of suicide. Well, Leroy Bennett, who was the founder of Ebony magazine, and there's another little small magazine used to be, it's slipping my mind right now, Jet magazine, wrote in one of his books that, in reply to Camus, that for the oppressed, the only issue is the question of homicide, which he frames as revolt. And Bell wrote that only the privileged have the option of demanding that ideas be novel, that principles be neutral, and solutions to problems conform to the privileged notions of fairness. History is not neutral. There are conquerors, there are conquered. People of color, we are conquered people. We are the way we are because we were kidnapped from Africa, forced to work, raped serially over generations. I didn't turn from black to this color by voluntary miscegenation, by voluntary race mixing. It was illegal. Even back when Thomas Jefferson was doing it in the 1770s, 1780s with Sally Hemings, it was illegal. He was molesting a 14-year-old child as a 30-year-old man, 9-year-old man. This was America. Also happened in the Caribbean. So critical race studies looks at the laws as a reaction to what was going on. And in America, the American economy was based upon slavery, whether you were in the North or the South. The farmers were in the South. The shipbuilding industry was in the North. The banking industry and the insurance industry, which financed the shipbuilding industry, financed the loans to the farmers, and financed everything involved in the business, was located in New York and Philadelphia. The shipbuilding was Boston, largely. This was an American enterprise. It was an enterprise of the colonies before there was America. What the critical legal scholars and Bell debunked were the myths that they all believed during the Civil Rights Movement. That a particular victory in a particular case might provide the long-sought solution to the racial division. That's reflecting Brown, that people thought that, Brown versus the school board would end racial segregation. The schools are segregated today. New York City has the most segregated system in the country. I think it's 74% the last time I looked of students in New York go to segregated school. Many whites still cling to the belief that racial justice may be realized with any loss of their privileged position. No, it can't. They got their privileged position by stealing from us. Stealing our labor, stealing our work, redlining our housing, so we had to live in poorer neighborhoods, so we amass less money. There's no way. Some people believe, and a lot of people want to believe, that time will change this, that all things will get better in time. The black poverty rate has not changed since the 1960s. The income gap between blacks and whites is as great as it was in the 1960s. The groundwork for changing this system, it's not there. The system depends on it. Look at Donald Trump. Look at Ronald Reagan. Look at Herbert Walker Bush. They all ran. Look at Barry Goldwater. They all ran for president using race as a motivator. This didn't start with Trump. The Republican Party didn't start going bad with Trump. That's a lie. They're hiding. These Republicans say, oh, I have to leave the Republican Party because Trump is not what I bargained for. You supported Reagan and you call him a hero. He ran for president on a states' rights platform, which originally was a pro-slavery slogan in the 1840s. Then by the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, it was a pro-segregation. And when he ran in 1980, he went down into outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered a few number of years before, and he talked about states' rights in that speech, signaling Southern whites that he was on their side in the fight against integration. He'd already opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act. This is who Reagan was, a stone cold anti-black racist. So Rand Paul, senator from Kentucky, still opposes it. He was interviewed by MSNBC TV host Rachel Maddow when he first ran for Congress, and she questioned him about that and really devastated him. It's a great interview. I saved that. I saved that recording because it was a masterful job she did on him. So this is the basis of critical race studies. So critical race studies as a field is a historical analysis which tells history from the perspective of the conquered, not the conquerors. Many white folks have a problem with that because American history is not pretty. They have put out a mythology that glorifies American history and ignores the extermination of the indigenous population, the theft of half of Mexico, the enslavement and murder of millions of black people in the international slave trade, and then the torture and murder of black people, the separation of children, the rape of black women and men, and the brutal beatings that slaves endured from 1619 until legal slavery ended in 1865, and then until the peonage system of slavery, which didn't end until 1942, 11 years rather before I was born. There's a great book, Slavery by Another Name, which talks about that. And there's also a PBS documentary on it called Slavery by Another Name. American history is not taught truthfully. A lot of folks out here don't want it taught truthfully. But there are a lot of good people out here who want the truth to come out so we can deal with it. America is a nation, it's not the only nation in the world that has a bad history. It has one of the worst. But there are nations that are just as bad. You know, Germany and Belgium are 2 of the worst. I mean, the Belgians killed over 10 million people. But I could go on for hours talking about this topic. I'm not. I think I've said enough. This is the longest video I've ever done because it's a topic that I care a lot about. But understand, critical race studies is a study of history, politics, economics, sociology, and all of these disciplines from the perspective of people who were conquered. And I'm going to end with one of my favorite Derek Bell books, and there are many. This one is Confronting Authority. And Derek Bell was an ardent protester, the reflections of an ardent protester. And his life has been a model for me, both intellectually and spiritually. And I'm thankful, very thankful, for having the opportunity, the short time I had to sit and talk with him. And I want you guys to have a good day. Any of you who actually sat and listened through this whole time, thank you. Thank you. And I'll leave you, as always, with resistance is not futile, and we can and will win if we fight the good fight. Have a good day.